Greetings. I thought it would be nice to do a 5-second nutshell, and I know it'll be more than 5 seconds, of American history from Columbus to, well, the Cold War. And by doing that, I'm doing that in the frame of trying to do deep background for the Electoral College video that I've done. Because I think it's super important to understand how America came to be where it was and how it came to be made up the way it was and culturally and racially and every other way. So I'm going to start with, I want you to take a quick picture of Europe. At the time of Columbus, Western Europe was primarily Catholic. From Scandinavia all the way down to Italy and all the way out to Portugal, Europe was Catholic. In 1492, both nations, Spain and Portugal, were starting to jump out into the ocean. Portugal more towards the Azores and then along the coast of Africa and eventually around Africa in 1498. And Columbus, thinking he could get to India directly because he thought the world was a smaller globe than it was, Columbus went across the ocean and bumped into now what we call the New World, which is ironic since people live there, but not India or the Indies where Columbus thought he was. And so we have a legacy still of calling those people, the Native Americans, Indians because of Columbus's mistake. I have a video on that, so you can watch that. So here's the thing. Spain and Portugal started colonizing the Americas, but primarily they did from the Caribbean, Florida, south. And they had so many squabbles that they asked the Pope to intervene. So even though Columbus got over there and back in 1492, and then he went a couple more times, in 1494, the Pope actually just drew a line, which you can see on the map, that cut the world in half. It gave the Americas to Spain except for Brazil. And Brazil was given to Portugal. But if you look at the line and think about it globally, it gave the Pacific to the Spanish, which is why eventually they'd find the Philippines and name it after their King Philip and own it for many, many years. And then it gave all of Africa to Portugal. I don't know if you ever understand hubris, but the Pope drew a line on the earth, not knowing very much about where North and South America really were or how big the Pacific was, and cut the world into a Spanish zone and a Portuguese zone. It's amazing. So by doing that, Portugal will do Brazil and then the slave trade, and Spain will take over everything from like Argentina all the way up to Mexico. And that is why, just so you know, that is why Latin America is Spanish speaking largely, except for Brazil, which is Portuguese speaking. And why both of those places, what we today call Latin America, is Catholic. But the big event that happened is in 1517, a fairly righteous, passionate, anti-Semitic German monk decided to protest against the Pope, call him on the carpet for some of the hypocrisies within the Catholic Church and within the papal office itself. And that event in 1517, this is 25 years after Columbus, only 25 years after Columbus, that Martin Luther starts what we call in history the Protestant Reformation, which, if you break down the words like I have on the screen, it's a protest against the Pope and wants a reform of the Catholic Church. And that is called the Protestant Reformation. And it creates an entire different Christian branch within the Christian world. There was Catholic and Eastern Orthodox before 1517, and after 1517, there's all the Protestant churches that include the Puritans, the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, and on and on and on. That's super important because most of England, for a long time, and for much of their time, became more Protestant, Anglican, most of Scandinavia became Protestant. The Holland or the Netherlands became Protestant. And so when it came to colonizing of the rest of the world, the only Catholic country to add to Spain and Portugal was France. Most of the rest of the colonization and migration of people to the New World, especially in North America, were Protestants, which changes the history of the world completely. And I have a diagram to kind of show you the advent of diseases in the Americas that the Spanish, Portuguese, and Europeans brought. They brought measles, mumps, smallpox, and a nice bug called the mosquito. And between those four, that ravaged and decimated much of the Native American population in the Americas. That's critical to our story because since so many Native Americans died and so many Native Americans didn't want to do work for the Spanish or Portuguese, that the Portuguese, because they owned Africa, according to the Pope, started a slave trade early on that brought West Africans as slaves to the New World, and that will change the dynamic of the entire New World for all of its history. So, Protestant nations also didn't care about what the Pope had to say. So that line of demarcation didn't matter to them at all. So right along the line, the Protestant nations started colonizing. Now, again, France is still a Catholic nation, but it came up to northern North America and took over a town called Quebec. The Netherlands, or Holland, took over a little place called New Amsterdam. We call it today New York. And then the British colonized Jamestown in 1607, and they did that in a colony named after the prior Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth I, and that's why they call that Virginia. They also then stole some Caribbean islands that were not taken or discovered by the Spanish at that time. And then, ironically, if you look at the line of demarcation, they took three places in northern South America, and we call that whole area the Guyanas. The British took one, that's called today Guyana. The middle one is today Suriname, and it was Dutch Guyana. And then the French took one, and it's still French Guyana today. So basically, if you take a look at where the Protestant nations colonized, they tried to take advantage of the line of demarcation and kind of the gray areas of where exactly that line was drawn and the geography of the situation. 1607 is when Jamestown was born, which is 115 years after Columbus. So a lot of things had been going on. Now, as time goes on, those early Virginians, had to deal with Native Americans, but not with as many Native Americans as there would have been had it not been for some of those diseases and all the rest. But those people did not represent a life or death threat to the Native Americans because the Native Americans, A, didn't really understand the rest of the world and the size of it, how many Europeans there were, how many more Europeans would come. They certainly thought there was a lot of room, and there was a boatload of room. And so it wasn't seen as a threat as much in 1607 as it was later in the 1600s and definitely in the 1700s. So the Native Americans did not and could not unite and knock all the European colonists into the ocean. Their numbers had been decimated, and they were not one people. The Native Americans are made up of many, many tribes, Cherokee, Choctaw, Seminole, etc., Iroquois, and they weren't united. And there you are. Sometimes if there's a new people coming into your lands, if you're not united about it and you're not consistent about it, the flood still happens. Now, we've mentioned the French took Quebec, the Dutch took New Amsterdam, and the English took Jamestown. And the reason I'm doing those is that those are the important ones in northern North America. And of course, between New Amsterdam becoming New York and Jamestown, that is the beginning of the American colonies. And the American colonies were born well after slavery was born. But there's one huge thing that the English did that was super unique to the early Spanish and Portuguese and to the French. The French, many, many times in their early colonial explorations, brought just their men, and those men interacted with the people that they found in the New World. The English, on the other hand, oftentimes early on brought their wives, and that would change the English colonies markedly compared to the French in Canada, because when they brought their wives, they weren't necessarily interacting as often with slaves and Native Americans. That's not to say that there wasn't interactions, because that would be naive. But the fact that they brought their women and had whites bred in America that became Americans was unique. Over the course of time, we purchased New Amsterdam and renamed it New York. We colonized all the way down to Georgia. Georgia, of course, is named for King George in England. And lots of the colonies were named after different monarchs in England. And all of that went on and on until the 1770s. By the 1770s, the French had lost their hold. The English had conquered Canada and owned everything from Hudson Bay all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico and didn't have really any threats. Well, we, which had become sort of Americans with a lot of English culture and practices and all the rest, realized we didn't have something to fight against because we'd eliminated most of the Indians. We'd eliminated the French. And in a sense, we eliminated the Spanish from Florida for that moment after the French and Indian War was over. And so the English had this huge predominance, and they also started raising taxes on us to pay for all the wars they'd fought on our behalf and on their behalf. And in those caused the friction that led to Boston massacres, Boston Tea Parties, and then in 1775, we actually shot at them in Massachusetts and started the American Revolution. Bearing in mind that the English are made up of many faiths, from Puritans to Quakers to Presbyterians to Lutherans to Anglicans, and they are majority Protestants, but a lot of variety, and that changed the way that our colonies kind of evolved. There's also people coming to America because they see opportunity. They want to explore. They want to have a fresh start. So whether you're persecuted in Europe and you want to come over, or if you just say, hey, I'm the second son of my dad and he's not giving me very much, so I want to start a farm over in the Americas, it's still unbelievably brave to jump in a boat, go across to a place you don't know anything about, and start a life. But immigrants happened, and they flooded into America. Now, it's a bigger flood later, but they're just coming. And many of them, like what we call the Pennsylvania Dutch, are actually the Pennsylvania Deutsch. We just said it wrong, and we still live with that crazy misunderstanding today. They're not Dutch. They're not from Netherlands and Holland. They're actually from Germany. I also want to mention that we have some people who come over with their fears. And those fears lead to some extremes, one of the most famous being 1692, the Salem witch trials, just so I've said that. But if we come back now to 1775, the 13 colonies ruptured with Britain. They are going to fight Britain in a war with highlights that go from Lexington Concord 1775 to Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence 1776, a battle against the British at Saratoga, 1778, that got us an alliance with the French. And in 1781, the French army, the American army led by George Washington, and the French Navy out on the coast, off the coast of Virginia, surrounded the British General Cornwallis and defeated him at Yorktown. And from that moment on, the British knew the gig was up. It took another 2 years to finally get everything signed. And in 1783, September 3rd, a date that should stand out one of these days, September 3rd, 1783, we gained our independence, gained it. We declared it in 1776, but it took us 7 years to win it. And in that moment, in 1783, we were a loose confederation of several states that were uniquely different. Some had slavery and agriculture. Some had independent farms in the middle colonies and northern colonies. Some small beginnings of industry were beginning in the northern colonies. And all of that was the case in the 1780s, but the United States was so scared to be a monarchy like what we broke from that we had this really loose confederation, basically 13 states, independent, but connected by common interest. For the first 6 years of our life, we were not under the Constitution. That was written later, 1787. And in 1787, the founders of America realized that we didn't have a person that could represent us with foreign nations, and there were lots of foreign nations to deal with. We didn't have a person in an emergency to make kind of executive decisions and get things done. And we had a hard time figuring out how we'd write the laws and agree to new laws across the whole country. And so what we did was in 1787 to 1789, we wrote up a new government, a completely new government. We invented 3 branches of government in this new document that will be known as the Constitution of America. Those 3 branches are the executive branch, which is a president. So during crises or dealing with foreign nations, we have a figurehead. Then we invented the legislative branch, which was Congress, made up of 2 houses, which I'll get to in a minute. And then we invented the judicial branch, and that is today, of course, the Supreme Court. So we created all of this, and we created the Constitution, which has held its time. But to get the Constitution, which was a change of a government, we changed our government. To get the people of America to agree to the change, we had to make some compromises, and those compromises have affected us ever since. So for the small states like Rhode Island, Connecticut, Delaware, we made the Senate, a congressional house made up of 2 representatives for every state, no matter how big or small you were. And we gave them that. Then we made the House of Representatives, and we did that by population. So the bigger states got their pacifier in their mouth, and they were happy. And then the last little ingredient was to get the southern states, who were markedly different than the northern and middle states, to agree to the Constitution change. And the way we did that was the 3/5 compromise, or the 3/5 slave rule, in which Southerners were given, hey, count all your slaves. I'm talking all of your slaves. Count all of them. Multiply by 60% or 3/5, and we'll add those votes to your votes. So that Southerners had more weight than the white population deserved. And the Southerners held on strong to that all the way to the Civil War. And even though the invention of the Electoral College, which is nothing more than you get to take the members of Congress that your state has, let's say 4, the numbers of senators you have, always 2, and you add those together, and that's how many electoral votes your state has. But the reason it was invented was so that there would be representatives that could all meet in Washington, because transportation communication in America in the 1780s and early 1800s was so slow that we didn't think it could be efficiently done any other way. So by creating these electors, which sometime when you have a minute, take a look at how we pick those. Take a look and see if you can find your electors from your state. But we picked these people to pick our president. And we thought, well, it's pretty representative because it's just your senators plus your congresspeople. But with the 3/5 rule, the South had more weight. And so they would have more weight in presidential elections. And holy cow, that would have made enormous changes in U.S. history. And the only reason that the 3/5 rule was finally thrown out, if I can be so direct and so blunt, is that so many immigrants came to America in the middle and northern colonies and states after our independence, that those immigrants and their becoming citizens of America eventually so outnumbered even the advantage of the slave situation. And bear in mind, by 1860, there's 4 million slaves, which means the South up to 1860 got 2.4 million more votes for their slaves that had no vote or no say in anything. 2.4 million extra votes the South had, but they still couldn't stop Lincoln in 1860 because the parties had split, so nobody got the majority of the vote anyway. But the Southern vote was just not preponderant enough, even with 2.4 million more votes, because of all the immigrants that had come over from Europe. And America changes enormously because of immigration throughout its history, so that's an important chapter just by itself. So the South knew the gig was up by 1860. We picked a president who wasn't for the expansion of slavery, and without the expansion, that means the 3/5 rule would eventually wither on the vine, and so the South seceded and we had a civil war. Americans would lose over 600,000 people fighting each other in the Civil War. And when the Civil War was over, the 3/5 rule died. But the South, they weren't ready. So even though there was a period of Reconstruction in which some blacks had the vote, and we actually had black congressmen briefly in U.S. history, by 1877, that period ended, and the South started doing things to marginalize and degrade the black population that was free, but not really in most aspects, because they invented black codes that kept the blacks from voting, from grandfather clauses to literacy tests to poll taxes to keep blacks from voting. They had the KKK and lynching to scare the blacks to death from ever voting. And then they did two other things. They did sharecropping, and sharecropping, without being too elaborate here, is, hey, you're on that plantation, but you're free now. But as long as you're in debt to me, you're not free to leave. So I invent a store on my plantation, and I invent rent for the free blacks to rent a place to live. And between the rent and the groceries and the clothes, coincidentally, I pay you just a smidge less than all those things cost. Therefore, you're in debt to me, and you're a slave in all things but name. And then for the slaves that left the plantation, the South passed an anti-loitering act that said if you couldn't get a job, we'd put you in prison. When we put you in prison, we hired you out to businesses. The jail collected the money, and you just worked really hard, a lot like a slave would, 14 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week, for nothing. And then after I let you out of prison, sometimes the prison sentence could be as high as 5 years for anti-loitering. You didn't get a job because now you had a record and you were black. So I put you back in prison and did that again. That peonage system that we did in the South lasted all the way till 1940s. Holy cow. The black codes were in place all the way till the 1960s. Holy cow. Lynching wasn't made illegal federally in this country until 2022. Like just the other day, 2022. And if it wasn't for what I'm about to talk about, blacks were relegated to second-class citizenship for many, many years from Reconstruction until the 1950s when the Civil Rights Movement started. The thing that transformed America, which I did a short video on, is the Great Black Migration. Because from 1915 to 1965, 6.5 million blacks simply voted with their feet. They moved to the north, they moved to the west, and got out of the South, where the second-class citizenship had just been too much to bear. And although they suffered prejudice, some segregation and things like that in the North and West, it wasn't near as bad as it was in the South. And that transformed America because it made urban areas like Chicago, like Detroit, like New York, have a black vote that made the politicians in America care what blacks had to say for really the first time nationally ever. And that Great Black Migration was a huge transformation of America because of the fact that most of the blacks that moved north had a vote somewhat, whereas they didn't have any in the South. Here's an interesting moment in history. It's 1929. We have been doing a census every decade from 1790 to 1920, and every time we did one, we would enlarge the House of Representatives a little bit more so that it would represent America better. And when we did that in the 1920s, the apportionment of the Congress and House of Representatives was a little too heavy in New York and a little too light in some other places to some Americans' liking. And so in 1929, when the stock market was doing very well and everything seemed good with the world and World War II hadn't started, the Great Depression hadn't happened, we passed an act. It's called the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929. And that act said we now have a ceiling on the House of Representatives, 435, not going bigger than that. America hasn't changed hardly at all since 1929. Haven't even grown very much at all, only by 200 million people. And what they now do, so that you're clear about the electoral votes, is that since your electoral vote is your senators plus your number of representatives, since they capped it at 435, now they just rearrange it. So as states got more and more people, they got more and more reps. And states that kind of stayed stagnant or maybe even lost some to migrations out west, let's say, or to the southwest, those were reduced. So New York had more electoral votes in 1952 than it does now. Wow. And Texas, California have more than New York, and Florida now equals New York. Actually, as of 2024, Florida now has one more than New York. Wow, what a change if you look at early U.S. history. So we now have mentioned that act, and we're going to do a separate video on that. But then to finish up, we didn't change that changed. In 1929, we made that ceiling. We didn't change that in the 1930s. We were very distracted in the 1930s by the Depression, the Dust Bowl, the rise of fascism. Then in the 1940s, we had World War II and the fights against the injustice of fascism, which is ironic because if you were a black person fighting with the American army, segregated at the time, in World War II, in Germany, you saw a sign on a bench that said, "No Jews." And then you had this moment where you just realized you'd seen a bench like that in Mississippi that said, no blacks, no Negroes, whatever, on this bench. And then you wondered to yourself what you were fighting for. Think about that. If you were a black person in the armed forces supporting the white army fighting in Germany in World War II, you saw their racism and wondered how much different the racism you suffered at home was. Think about that. That's the birth and the seed of the civil rights movement, because without blacks coming back to America and realizing that what we fought for in World War II is what we should fight for in America, the civil rights movement makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? And so in the 1950s, we have the Cold War fighting against the injustices of another kind of dictatorship. And yet in dictatorships, bear in mind, dictatorships are defined by not having a vote. There's a person in charge and there's not a vote. But I will say to you that when America started to realize that we fought against fascism and communism, maybe it was time to fight against racism in America. And that is where you get the 1950s, 60s civil rights movement. I'll quit there. please take a look at some of the other videos that I have done on Electoral College and some other videos that are associated with some of the topics I bring up, and have a great day.